All right. Welcome to the Policy Committee meeting, Tuesday, August 17th, 2021. Has this meeting been properly posted, Julie? Thank you. This evening we'll have public comment, and then we have a couple policies to discuss. And we will begin with public comment. We have, I believe, 4 that have signed in for that. Practices, I will call your name. You may come up to the podium over there. You do not have to give your specific address, just what community you are from. And we would ask that you, because we've got 4, we can have 3 minutes apiece. At 2.5 minutes, Julie will give you a notice that you're at 30 seconds. So I will start with Rebecca Damore. Let's make sure we're on.
Testing.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, my name is Rebecca. I live in Waukesha. My son will be a first grader in the dual language program. I am here at the last meeting before the start of the school year to beseech you to require masks in our schools per the recommendations of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, the Wisconsin DPI, the CDC, the Wisconsin DHS, and the Waukesha County Public Health Department. If you are unwilling to vote in accordance with the guidance of these reputable scientific and medical organizations for the entire district, at least please consider mitigation efforts for the schools with children aged 11 and under who are currently unqualified for a COVID vaccine. If you are unwilling to implement COVID mitigation efforts in elementary schools, please offer one elementary school with dual language in the district that will follow the CDC guidelines. I will drive my child to any school if that should be the case. There is no virtual option for dual language. As such, I must choose to send my 6-year-old to a school I don't deem safe, or he will lose his spot in the dual language program. I know my family is not alone in this awful position. Masks are the best protection for those unable to be vaccinated. And while my child may wear a mask, masks work best when all of us wear them to prevent our droplets from infecting one another. Today I would like to talk about numbers. 1,900. That's how many children were in U.S. hospitals over the weekend with COVID, a record high per the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. 4,404 U.S. kids have contracted multi-system inflammatory syndrome as a result of COVID per the CDC. 423 children ages 0 through 18 have died from COVID in the U.S. per the CDC. Almost half of children who contract COVID-19 have long-lasting symptoms called long COVID, which may include respiratory problems, heart palpitations, headaches, nausea, seizures, hallucinations, and testicular pain, per a March 2021 article from the National Center of Biotechnology Information. Per the AAP, the number of children with COVID are again increasing and at an alarming rate due to the Delta variant. As I read these statistics, let me note I shouldn't have to stand before you reminding you of the data. The nonpartisan experts in public health, medicine, and epidemiology have already reviewed all data and recommended everyone older than age 2 wear masks in schools regardless of vaccination status. At the school board meeting on May 13th, 2021, a school board member expressed support for reducing COVID mitigation efforts, saying, in essence, COVID is changing and we must adjust our strategies in accordance. Well, COVID, again, is evolving, although not in the direction we also desperately hoped. Our numbers are climbing in Wisconsin and Waukesha. Please reconsider our mitigation efforts in light of this new Delta variant. This virus has evolved, and our implementation of COVID mitigation efforts must evolve as well. Per Children's Hospital, the Delta variant is about 60% more transmissible than the primary COVID-19 virus. And again, per Children's Hospital, the Delta variant can carry up to and release 1,000 times more virus in nasal passages than those infected with the original strain. This is new information and must be considered. Please call and second a motion to discuss COVID mitigation strategies for the 21-22 school year in light of the new Delta variant. Please protect our kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next up, Paul Reese. Paul?
Good evening. It's been a while. Last time I spoke here was in October, and I want to apologize to you, Mr. Baumgart. I let my emotions get the best of me. There's no hard feeling. I have no animosity towards you. Okay. I just want to be clear on that I have no ill will towards you and your always in my prayers. I want to talk about the open speaking portion of this meeting. I said something when I was talking to you, addressing you, and I'm just going to read something. It's Acts 9:5. And the Lord said, "Who art thou?" And, it's actually Saul talking. And he said, "Who art thou, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. Is it hard for thee to kick against the pricks?" That's how I use the term prick. I did not use it in a derogatory fashion. And yet, Mr. Siebert sent me a letter along with President Joe Cuomo saying that I used it in a derogatory fashion. Where do I go to address this? Who do I see to address this when he stops me from speaking to you? I did not use it in a derogatory fashion. I quoted something, and the word prick is used often. A doctor says you'll feel a prick when he sticks you with a needle. Well, is that wrong? Should he be ashamed for saying that? I did not use that in a derogatory fashion, and I was hung out for it. And where do I go to address this? Joe says I can't speak here. I can't speak here. There's nothing I can do about it. And that's why I've been pushing Kelly and Anthony a bit to do something about this, to take care of this, because it's not right that he has that kind of power to just say arbitrary when I cannot speak. There was no end date given to me in my letter. It's just whenever. So the game was that I would have to go get a lawyer. That was the game. And so that I would have to pay money to take him to court to let me speak. Well, I found a better way. I got 2 people elected to this school board. I worked hard for that. And I beat him at his game, and I wanted to get a patio poured. I'm getting that patio poured, and I'm not paying for a lawyer. So that was my intent, and that's what I am here for tonight. And I'm disgusted by the way it was handled by Joe, and he's lied on a number of occasions on things like this and twisted them out of context. So thanks.
Paul? Samuel D'Amico?
Good evening. Tonight, I would like to speak in favor of the items Dr. Piasek has laid out for provisions to the public comment policy. These are nonpartisan provisions that I believe the vast majority of speakers do and would approve of, and they're provisions that every single member here, including Mr. Zenobia, expressed support for at the July 28th Public Policy Committee meeting. Number 1, the addresses of speakers are collected on a sign-up sheet before the meeting. I just filled one out about 20 minutes ago. And of course, I wrote down my address. As a minor, I am not required to state my address to the board during my speech, though I see the security concerns and uncomfortability behind publicly stating your address. Because not only are you publicly stating your address to everyone in the room, it is also being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. I do agree with Dr. Piasek and her provision to remove the rule. Number 2, if there are a sizable number of speakers, the board president or chair of a committee can reduce the amount of time each speaker is allotted. Ergo, if there are less than 6 speakers, it makes sense to allow more time for each speaker to speak. I agree with Dr. Piasek. If there are less than 6 speakers, in some way there should be a 5-minute maximum time, while still expecting for about 3 minutes to speak. Although there is one item I would like to express my concern for and opposition to, and I quote from item G in the public comment policy: speakers should not address or question board members individually. Personally, I don't agree with this, and I find myself agreeing with both Mr. Zenobia, who said, "What are we trying to prevent from happening?" And Dr. Piasek, who said, "I have no problem with being included or directed in comments." I don't see a problem with public accountability. As a public official, you represent the school district of Waukesha and vote in favor or opposition to budgets, rules, and curriculum. And I believe at any time, any person should have the right to come to a meeting, and specifically address one or more members. I don't see a problem with this, and it seems that most members here don't either. So I'd like to request that one of the board members ask to remove the phrase, speakers should not address or question board members individually from item G in 0167.3 public policy. Thank you for the time to allow me to speak tonight. I'd also like to thank Dr. Piasek for taking the time to write these provisions, because I agree with you. And as you said in an email to me, and I quote, "These provisions are and will be more favorable to speakers as it should be," end quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And Rebecca Flaherty, please.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Flaherty, and tonight I'm going to use all 3 of my minutes to read excerpts to you from books in our middle school libraries. I'm just kidding. Last week was super painful. I'm not going to put you through that again. But I do ask, how did this happen under your watch? What are you going to do to correct it? And how are you going to prevent it from happening again? You said you have a budget surplus. Let's use it to do some library audits. Today I want to talk again about curriculum transparency. Critical theory is not the same as thinking critical. CRT teaches that white people are inherently bad. The Shroki-Hawley training for our teachers, which I watched hours of, encouraged them to accept students swearing in the classroom, talking over them, and cheating because it's culturally acceptable. That's not respectable for teachers and will not prepare our children for the workforce. Last week during the board meeting, a parent said that we need to teach CRT because some white students called black students the N-word, which is horrible. But CRT will not fix that. It'll make it worse. CRT divides people by race. Instead, let's teach our children about kindness, acceptance, human decency, and respect. Don't let teachers teach our children that America is a racist country. Why aren't all teachers standing for the national anthem? What does this say to our students? That America is not a country we're celebrating? Stop letting your schools and classrooms be used to indoctrinate children into a radical left-wing worldview and try to turn our children into activists for that cause. There are BLM signs in our classroom and hallways. Does this mean that you will also allow Ku Klux Klan signs? Where do you draw the line? How about drawing the line at getting political propaganda and hate of all kinds out of our schools? I ask that you immediately stop all school discussions, lessons, and activities that push hate and a blatantly partisan agenda, including the denunciation of American history as one of genocide, enslavement, and exploitation, including teachings of the historically inaccurate and misleading 1619 Project. Any teachings about anti-racism, systematic racism, white cisgender Christian privilege, microaggressions, intersectionality, and white supremacy. Any teachings about the hostility towards the nuclear family, police brutality, and the defund the police movement. Stop all propaganda activities and discussions that divide or classify people with the goal of making any child or teacher feel guilty about who they are and who their parents are. This is discrimination, and under Wisconsin State Statute 118.13, it says no person shall be discriminated based on sex, religion, national origin, ancestry, creed, and it goes on. We know this is already going on in our classrooms. Therefore, like last week, I'm going to ask you again. Starting September 1st, I ask that you demand full curriculum transparency. You and every parent should have easy digital access to what their children are being taught. Let parents see all lesson plans, handouts, videos, books, and discussion material for all classes that their children are in. Provide digitized classroom library lists so we can ensure our children have access to classroom libraries with a balanced selection of books and not just books to push a leftist agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Just before we move to the next thing, is anybody else wanting to address us? Okay. Oops, I lost my place. Sorry. We move into action item, approval of the minutes from our previous board meeting.
So moved.
Moved for approval by
Yes.
Patrick. Questions? Second. Was that a second or was it?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Kelly. Anything changed in there? Okay. All in favor of accepting the minutes from our July meeting, please say aye.
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 Opposed? 4-0, Julie. Thank you. And we have now a discussion policy with possible action. Policy 0167.3, public comment at board meetings. This was taken to the full board meeting last week. Several questions were raised to bring it back here for further discussion. And that's where we are. Let me just get to that. So, somebody want to start? Not we. I'm looking for a sheet of paper. Go ahead, Connie.
I'd be happy to help us jump in. Just to maybe clear away some of the things that I think we do have consensus on. I'm looking at the revised version dated March 10th, 21. Is that correct?
Yes.
Actually, it would be the latest revised, but I think it does have a March 10th
That's
date on it.
correct.
My understanding is that the revised items D and E, D relating to addresses and E relating to time, was not under question by the full board. I'm curious if other committee members heard that as well.
Yes. That came up as a possible, but at this point, we decided not to carry it any further.
Possible, the time one or the address?
No,
Oh, the addresses.
The addresses, I think there was agreement on the addresses that we don't have to say them. There was, and I honestly don't remember if that was at the board meeting or subsequently, the discussion about do they live in Waukesha or do they not live in Waukesha? And we did talk about at least identifying the community you are from. There's too many issues with is it Waukesha or do you live in Waukesha or not? For one, we have students here whose parents do not live in Waukesha. Anything is open enrollment. So I don't think anybody was pushing to change this right now. At least I'm not aware of it.
Federal funding, people all over the country pay for our schools.
So go ahead. We're going to set that one aside for now.
Yeah, I think so. I think if anything, Mr. Como had maybe brought up to know if people are in district or not. I think to Mr. McCaffrey's point, it's really difficult to know that. And simply by stating addresses, especially around here, I think it's nearly impossible to know that. So,
Yes.
so I just wanted to kind of maybe put on the table so we could move past D and E.
Yes.
I think we're okay there.
Yep.
And then F as well was one we had just shortened, saying you could only speak once. And G, topics within the jurisdiction of the board. Just in reference, one of the speakers referred to an item G, which is actually an item G from a previous version of the policy, so we'll get to that. And that's actually reflected in item H. So item H now is the one that includes direction of comments to the board, and who should be addressed. If you recall, we changed shall to should. At the time, it was shall.
Should.
At the time, I think Mr. Zenobia and I had also both proposed to strike that completely, and that was part of discussion.
Strike H completely?
To strike all but the last sentence of H.
Right.
Because
I agree with that, Dr.
Because it
Piazza.
says should, it's not compulsory, right? We're not holding it to
Right.
policy, but
So-
it's tough to enforce.
So
Exactly.
how are you modifying it now?
Just to include the last sentence.
The proposal would be to strike all of H except for the last sentence.
In the interest of time, board members will not respond to speakers during the public comment.
May I just add something to that?
Yes, I was going to ask.
To comply with the open meetings law,
Pardon?
where, I mean, if the only way to engage a topic for debate is if it's agendized on the board. So in the interest of time, I would propose or suggest that you add and to comply with the open meetings laws.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Sure. Sure.
Oh, okay. And
Debate's not
And
agendized, you
comply.
can't have it.
We would say to comply with statute 19.9, or would we say?
I'd have to look at what that specific statute is, but it's generally just understood as the open meetings.
we can add that numerically in here.
Sure, we could build a citation in if it's
Right.
helpful.
Okay.
Another thing with what Dr. Piazza just said, if everything was eliminated but the last sentence, if, someone really is out of line, the steps below that pretty much take care of that, when we get into that. So I'm supportive of that.
Okay. Anybody else on that one? I'm okay with it. I don't see it as a big deal.
I guess I just think whatever we have here is going to have to be enforceable and consistently enforced by all of us, or, we'll be right back to where we were, so.
And I think that gets us down to item 5.
Under I-5.
Yep.
Yes.
Just first for discussion, I know we had agreed at the last policy committee meeting that we would strike the waive the rules. Is everybody still in agreement that we would strike that? So
Seems crazy
Yep.
to me.
Say that again, please.
the striking of waive the rules, we would keep that out so that every committee and every board proceeding
yes, we had
goes
that
the
out.
same way. And then I know Mr. Montijo and Mr. Como had a lot of comments about what was in that section 5, or that item 5. And I don't want to run this meeting, so I think it would be open to discussion, just what we heard and what might be some thoughts about how we could approach that.
Right.
I did look into the policies a bit for closed session. There is a provision in 19.85, section 1, subsection F, the one that we apply actually for expulsion committees and other things, that would say that, to prevent essentially public discussion on an individual, but we could potentially, I think we'd have to get an opinion on that, but we could potentially go to a closed session.
Well, Mr. Dietz did reach out and ask that we look into some of these things.
Yes.
And so I did speak with Gary Resch this afternoon on some of the questions. And if I look at Mr. Como's questions on would we call the special meeting for this or could we do it at a regular meeting, the answer to that is either. It would be the board's discretion. It would be posted. You don't have to specifically post the person's name. So if Joe Cook was the person who was disorderly at the meeting and you wanted to entertain me, you could say to consider a citizen's conduct at the meeting or several citizens if it was multiple individuals. And I know he asked that if, you can entertain this similar to how you would entertain anything at a meeting. You're just determining the length of the meeting that you want to have. The discussion around closed session versus open session, if the board were considering only the information that we had, say for instance on video, if I got up to the podium and I was disorderly in nature and the board as evidence only looked at what was on the screen in consideration of it, that could be done in an open meeting. If the comments only pertain to what you observed in the meeting. But if Mr. Dietz knows that, for instance, my wife was diagnosed with cancer and my parents just died and my kids are sick, and that contributes then to why I made the comments that I made, you would want to then notice that as a closed session discussion because any of that in open session could be defamatory to me.
Right.
And so what you want to avoid is any defamation of character with this. So it's something that would require some balance if the board were to discuss it open versus closed session, and what would warrant then going into closed session.
So, looking at the list that I wrote down from our board meeting, these are my own words. Do we require a special meeting? And the answer is we can determine that depending on the situation. We do not have to post the person's name, correct?
We would have to, in writing, notify the person that it was being discussed at the meeting. So if you were to talk about my conduct, you would have to give me a letter that says, at the upcoming board meeting, we're going to talk about your conduct.
Okay.
So just a quick question.
Go, I'm sorry.
So if we're closed, does that person have the ability to face his accusers?
If we go into closed session and that person wanted to bring witnesses in to talk about their character, absolutely.
They would have the right to do that.
They would have the right
under
to,
law.
yep.
Yes.
You'd have that protection. You could do that even in an open
In
setting.
an open session, but I know that the closed sessions,
Right.
taboo about.
Right. So you would be opening up. I think there would be further questions because one of the things that Gary hit on is making sure that you have a spelled out process as to how you would want to deal with this, and then making sure that anything that you're considering separates a person's First Amendment right to, speak in a manner that they want to. If they don't like Bill, they could say they don't like Bill, whatever it might be. But then to also then tease out what would be considered disorderly, disruptive, an issue against the board during a public meeting.
Another question that was raised was, what if it's a group of people?
And that would be what I said before. I mean, it would be, you'd have to address and notify each individual in the group that you were discussing it and treat each individual's behavior as separate. But you could do that at a regular meeting. You could do that as a special meeting and just handle it item by item by item.
Any further questions on this? I do have one, and it came up in my head someplace. Up till now, we have not had a board to make this decision. We've had two people make the decision. The president of the board and the superintendent. I'm not real sure that I'm comfortable using the whole board to make a decision on this, because in some situations could arise where a certain majority of the board might support this person. Similar to what we've been through recently. Do we have a situation where we are causing the board to submit to something that maybe isn't always a board issue? Should it in fact be a board member, and a staff member, and a community member, or something other than board? Just something that came in my head.
I think that Mr. Montijo brought up a couple of good points. I did watch the last board meeting several times over just to make sure I had a handle on what was discussed. And he talked about, how do you define what's obscene, or how do you define what's disorderly? And I think that once that was defined and the board had a good understanding of it, it would have to uniformly be applied, so that if every time I got to the podium, if Dr. Siebert and I were the two people in question, our comments, if they were not profane, using profanity, whatever it might be, but they were things that you disagreed with as board members or whatever it might be, that was protected then under speech. But if we, left the podium, if we shouted from the audience, if we did that, we'd have to have a good understanding so that it could be uniformly applied. There is a level of risk when you go into having a body make that decision, because you wouldn't want to somehow, based off of, affiliation with people in the audience, people who have, certain interests and certain policies where, their behavior would be excused where other people would be sanctioned in some way or, way, shape, or form.
Kind of why I'm wondering if it should be the full board to do this.
So maybe just comment on what Mr. Montijo raised at the last board meeting. The terms obscene, disorderly, irrelevant, abusive, reasonable decorum, those were all part of the previous policy.
Yes, they
so
are.
Those aren't new words, and I think that probably is what creates some of the challenges and ambiguity along the way. I think if you take it the other way, if I were in Mr. Como's shoes, certainly I would not want to be in a position to have that make that decision on behalf of the whole board. And I think he raised the point that there was a lot of discussion. I think we run the same risk if there's one or few people who are left responsible to make that decision, that, for lack of a better word, biases could interfere. And so that was the motivation behind at least a majority of the board. We could, potentially take an approach like we do with expulsion committees. And I just hope that we don't need to do it that often. This really should be a very rare exception. And
We had 2 in 27 years that I'm around, so.
yeah. And part of my intent, I've said this a few times, was to make it difficult, right? It should not be something that we're like, oh, we're going to do another one. It really should be something that we enter
Right.
into very seriously, so.
Yeah, Anthony,
First, let me apologize for getting here late tonight. Sorry I missed some of this conversation. If this point's been made, forgive me. When we talked about this at the full board meeting the other night, the comment was made that, legal looked over what was done in the past with the couple of instances. And, my thought was, why pay legal to do something that, we make bigger decisions, I think, as a board than to, if action needed to be taken to punish someone, so to speak, to not be able to speak for a little while, I think the sense of fairness by 9 board members or a majority of the board to sit down and say, hey, let's look this over. I don't know if there would ever be a need for people to recuse themselves based on their personal relationships with people. I'm sure that could happen. But to put this in the hands of a legal department that costs probably a lot of money, which I think was a comment made that, why would we incur that as opposed to handling it ourselves?
I think anybody is suggesting we use a legal department to.
No, I'm sorry. The comment made by President Como at the meeting was he sat down with administration and legal was brought in on a couple of.
Oh, on that one. Okay.
So that's what I'm referencing the comment to. I just, if the board can sit down with expulsion panels, a much more serious thing, I think, than this matter. They certainly could do so if action needs to be taken to, for a time period to have someone not speak for a little while. So that was the point I wanted to make.
And again, just going back to my discussion then with Gary this afternoon, it was along the lines of that we need to make sure, the board needs to make sure that any decision to limit speech is not going to be based off of some infringement on somebody's First Amendment, and the board would need to be mindful of that.
Right.
And nor would the public discussion, if there was a public discussion, lend itself to be defamatory to anybody's character, and so there's some careful treatment around that as well, because either what is it, the ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure. You pay a little bit on the front end to make sure the process is solid instead of paying a lot on the back end if you run into legal challenges. And that's the test, I guess, that the board has to consider with a policy like this.
Be quite blunt, because we had never had any of this situation for a long time. I think there was reason that Joe had to probably got on to calling the law into place at that time, because that was new to us. Okay, now back to what we've got here. We really have answered most of the questions that were raised at the full board meeting, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if.
I have one more.
Yes, go ahead, Greg.
Let's say that we approve this as a board. Neola would then look at this, and they would give us their take on whether they would or no.
No, I mean, an adjustment to this level is saying this is how we want to operate.
Okay.
So we're drafting, what is our own policy. And again, Neola would always defend a policy that they made, the policy.
Okay.
Right? But they're not going to defend you in court. They would take care of the policy component of it. They would make sure that their policy was legally compliant. If it wasn't, they'd cover that part of any adjustment. But what they won't do then is, take the additional steps. So if there was any other legal, that a citizen brought it forward against us, we would be on our own with that.
Sure.
It really is the Neola service. What it does is it gives you a legally compliant policy in the template format with options that are legally compliant. We as a district can build upon that. But when you get into the operations end of it, when you implement it, you're on your own for the implementation of it. It's just making sure instead of going to the attorneys every time you want to do policy updates and paying the hourly rate, you're getting that, kind of a bulk rate on legal policy.
So whenever this is approved, hopefully next meeting, we don't have to run that by Neola, we just have to inform them of it? Is that how that works?
What we may want to do, though, in the final form is run it by, our council one more time. Because, again, making sure that we have a process that's in place that, does keep us, from infringing on somebody's First Amendment rights.
Right.
That lists steps, Mr. Zenobia mentioned the expulsion proceedings. We worked with council to make sure that we had a template to guide us through an expulsion proceeding so that we always stayed, lockstep with what we needed to do, making sure that the kid had their rights and were able to present their case to the board. I think we would want to do something similar with this so that we gave the citizens their due diligence to it.
And wouldn't it be a good idea to do that before the full board votes on it?
Yeah, whatever recommendations
draft
the
we have
committee
tonight,
has
so that we could go in and say.
They can go back starting tomorrow and work on that.
Yeah. And it might be an addition to it. I received something And I think, Anthony, you might have received this as well. I'm not sure. I couldn't make heads or tails out of this. From a citizen who was upset over the last meeting and the the comments regarding some of those books and the sex in those books. Asking, and I think is a valid ask, regarding the shock value of something like this, quite simply, should there be some kind of a trigger warning regarding things like rape and sexual assault or violence or something? Should there be some kind of an opportunity as one of those presentations begins that we might have a trigger warning that this is happening, and if you feel you or your children should leave the room or turn off your TV for now, that might be an okay idea. And when I got that, I couldn't say no to that. I thought that's a pretty legitimate idea. So I don't know if we want to consider pulling that into the process or not. I'm going to just say that's what was given to me. Thoughts? Anthony?
Sure, if I could. I believe I did get that email as well. And I also had another person that was here at the time in the meeting who also mentioned to me that they felt the same way. What I would say to that is I don't know if we need something in the rule. From the other night of what happened, given how explosive it was and how many people had things to say, I thought it was actually handled fairly well by the board to sit and listen. I know some people gave warning, they said, to people before the meeting. I don't think that's a bad idea. I think that could be handled by the chairperson of the committee, by the president, could say, we know there's going to be some materials read tonight. Maybe we could get warning from the readers, the comments, to say, we know there's going to be some of this. Here's your 1 minute warning.
That could be the warning.
And so I don't have a problem with that. I don't know that it needs to be in writing. One thing on point 5 under J in the policy where it says waive these rules. And I know we've got that crossed out. Maybe that's the wrong language there, but maybe it should say something to the effect that, the committee chair, the president, has the option to give latitude or whatever to allow people to speak, and even in sensitive cases like this, to be heard. I don't think the comments themselves were handled incorrectly by this board. I think people were heard. Some people were surprised by it. There was a lot of interruptions, but overall, the points got across. People didn't get too out of hand. I think overall people were fairly respectful of one another, although they obviously disagreed with one another quite a bit in some cases. It could have been much worse. Could it have been perfect? Sure. But I think this needs to be some leeway at the chair position to say, hey, pause, do this, do that. I don't know how many rules we can, because a lot of these rules were broken by people throughout, just in things like applause or interruption. And we're not going to bring 50 people before a committee to say, hey, you can't do this, right? I mean, that's not the point. So that's my comment on that.
Thoughts or concerns on this? Yeah, Greg?
I guess when it's finally in approved form, do you see, Mr. Baumgart, the committee coming up with the script, or someone else coming up with it, or a group of people coming up with a script that the board president would read or the committee chair would read before each meeting?
Oh, you're talking about the onset of this thing?
Yes.
We'll just do that way we have in the past. We'll put that script together.
Someone will develop that.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
But first, we have to decide what it's going to look like.
Yep.
I'm getting the impression that maybe we want to really do some work on it before we bring it back to the full board. Is that what you were saying before? I mean, is this ready to go back the next Wednesday?
I think it's ready. Or I think it's really close, if
Okay.
not. I mean,
I think we got the clarification tonight that we need, and I do.
Covered those, yes.
Yeah, I do think there's a procedure that needs to be placed behind the policy, but I don't think that we want to reduce the procedure to the policy. So the process that we go through, I think maybe the one unresolved item, although maybe I'm the only one that hasn't heard consensus on it, is this issue of bringing this to a majority of a board, because we put some different opinions on the table.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways we could go about this, with a smaller committee, with a committee of board officers who are elected by the board as the board leaders, perhaps.
That's where I'm a little left in ambiguity also. Which way would you prefer to go? I don't know. Again, we may not do this for another half a century, so.
I think that the intent or the goal is to have it be fair and unbiased. And you've raised a concern that if a board leans a certain direction, that might appear to be biased. I've argued the other side, which maybe if an individual leans a certain direction, that might appear to be biased. So would the elected officers of the board be representative of the board in that case? That's just another option I'm throwing on the table. The officers plus the superintendent is 5?
No, I understand what you're saying, Bill, but I think it should be the whole board, the majority of the board. I don't get offended easily, so I don't. You know me. So I mean, to me, it doesn't matter if it's the whole board. I think that obscene is obscene, regardless of whether you're a liberal or conservative, Republican, Democrat. It doesn't matter. I mean.
Okay.
I mean, if a member said something, something obscene, I don't really care if he voted for me or not, to tell you the truth. If it's obscene, it's obscene. I mean, what are you going to do? That's just me, though. And you've known me a long time, and you know how I look at things. So,
Not
I mean.
necessarily the same as everybody else.
Well, that's true, but.
Well,
That's true, but that's why I think. I mean, I have faith in the other people on the board that they all know what obscene is, and they all know if someone flips us off, it's obscene, and is what it is.
We can go in with. I don't have a particular hang-up on using the full board. I don't know. I don't have that hang-up, but it's one of those things that crossed my mind.
Yeah, no, I understand the bias problem. I mean,
Can there be a bias?
Yeah.
I guess. In the wording of it, we could leave it at the full board, and you might even have something reserving it such that if, assuming there's no bias involved or something. I don't know how you
Right.
could word that, but.
Yeah, no.
The other approach would be to have a committee representing a majority of the board. So that would be a committee of 5 that could just be determined ad hoc.
That I like better.
I do too.
Have to change the other policy, Joe? Or how would that work? I mean, you got to be careful about just creating a committee to
We have a policy.
limit somebody's
We have a
constitutional
policy on
rights.
we have a policy on the board committees,
Yeah.
and so this would probably have to take on, ad hoc consideration, public speaker
It would be a
consideration.
major ad hoc committee.
Different than we do with the expulsions, though.
Right.
So we don't call it a committee. We call it a panel. The expulsions
Right.
are
Right.
panels of 3 that we rotate.
Yeah, but it's still, panel, committee,
Well, their
That-
issue there is are we going to get into forming a committee that we maybe aren't.
well, it's-
Never use.
if it's a committee that is as a result of the direction of board policy to act in behalf of
Board
the
committee.
board, you run all of the meeting notice requirements anyway. So whether you call it committee, whether
Okay.
you call it panel, whether the name,
Okay.
I think the name is semantics because
It
it's going
is,
to be made up
right.
of board members. The majority of the people present will be boards and they're going to be performing a board function. So it automatically goes under the public, notices and, does the meeting then get posted as a closed session meeting to consider? Is it handled in a public session? It's just a matter of then, are you setting up a separate meeting then to consider the behavior of a citizen at a board meeting, for some sort of sanction that the board may levy against that person?
So it would basically be the same process that we're using in that other circumstance.
For
We
expulsion.
still have to write it up, but
Correct. I mean, it could be a consideration panel. I mean, however you wanted to name it. What I'm getting at
Okay.
is it's still a function of the board. So the name doesn't matter. It could be a board committee or it could be a panel. Either one is represented in policy somewhere else.
not looking for votes. Oh,
And the board president would be involved, I would think, no matter what. It could be a panel of 4 the first semester and the other 4 the second semester, if it was a panel of 5.
Yeah, plus the president. So it'd be, the president
total.
plus 4 board members.
And then you could have 4 first semester, 4 second semester.
You would want to have an odd member in order to
Sure.
ensure that there was
5
a
and
majority
5.
vote one way or another.
be agreeable to writing that into it.
The disadvantage to that, for example, though, is that you can't just forward it to a future board meeting that would already have a standing.
Separate meeting.
Right, like expulsions.
I don't think that is a big problem. It ain't going to happen that
Let's
often.
assume it's rare, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to
So-
happen either.
Okay, we've been through most of these issues now. I guess the question is it ready to rewrite it and take it back in September?
One question that I do have for the committee, it's a step before you get into actually giving somebody a sanction. Would there be any interest in having in there that the board president would, formally notice a person that their comments or behavior was, I'm just grabbing at a term, disorderly in some fashion, and that any future behavior at a board meeting would then trigger the steps that are built into policy,
Yeah.
Yes.
this policy.
That in?
That we have used that step before with people to notice them that their behavior was questionable at a meeting and that any further behavior would result in some level of sanction.
Like a warning.
A formal letter, a warning letter.
Right.
I mean, one would hope that if an adult did step out of line, that letter would correct any future behavior before you got to the sanction. And then that would prevent any sort of defamation of character or First Amendment infringement.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
I'm getting nods all the way around.
Yep.
So if we draft something like, in point 5 that addresses that, board president, would you be comfortable if it was the board president's responsibility to send that notice?
Yes,
Letter of warning?
yes, you could put that in number 5.
Yeah, so the board president would send it, so if an F and F, if I want somebody to get a warning letter, the board president would send it, not the chair of F and F. Correct. Yep, nope, I think that's fine.
Maybe just one clarification on that is either to be cautious not to make it a prerequisite to the discussion, just on the consideration that something might be extremely egregious.
Yeah, I mean, a fist fight's not going to warrant a warning letter.
No.
Maybe,
You know what
just
I mean?
building upon the unless a
I know
physical
what you
safety
mean.
concern.
Right.
Yeah.
There is the statement in there, unless a physical safety concern is
Right.
proven, so similarly, unless a physical safety concern is proven, the board president may send a letter to a public speaker who, was out of line at a meeting, and then, that could then trigger further steps in the future.
I think that's very
Okay.
clear.
Kelly? We should really seek approval of this work we've done tonight, with the intention of bringing it, and I don't have the date in front of me for the board meeting in September. Do you happen to, Julie?
September 15th.
15? Did we slip it a month?
A week.
No,
Just a week back
Memorial
because of
Day.
Slipped it
Labor
a
Day.
week back, that's what
Labor Day.
15th is, okay.
Changes as amended tonight, because it's been through committee multiple times, it can go to the board for
Oh, we don't have to vote on that again?
No, you'd vote on it
Oh, I
tonight.
thought so.
Aye. Yeah, with the revisions.
I would be seeking a motion for accepting it, as we discussed tonight, for moving it to the board on September 15th.
So moved.
Patrick, seconded by,
I'll second.
No,
Or
you're late.
Anthony, go
Anthony
ahead.
got it.
Anthony got it, yep.
further discussion?
Joe, you have a good understanding of where we're at?
Julie's got the notes, we've
Between
got
the
it
two
on
of you?
video,
Yep.
and
Okay.
we'll have a mock-up policy.
We're on video.
Yes.
In a Friday update, we'll separate this Friday update, we'll make sure that it's out there so that everybody's aware of what was discussed tonight prior to the September board meeting,
Yeah.
so people can put their eyes on it.
Yeah.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? 5-0, Julie.
I just want to thank everybody because I think we've made made some major improvements in a policy that needed it. And it's only fair to be transparent in what we want, and then our job will be to make sure it's enforced. So I
Okay.
think we made some significant improvements to a policy that needed it. Thank you.
Okay, leaves us with a discussion item on policy 2240, controversial issues in the classroom. And Anthony, you brought this one up, asking if we could talk about it.
Yeah, the reason I brought up policy 2240 was in light of a lot of the discussions we've had in the past couple of months in regards to things being taught in the classroom. The point B in the second paragraph is does not tend to indoctrinate or persuade students to a particular point of view. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about controversial issues being taught, and I think that there's probably some violation of this going on from what I've heard from parents and teachers, and so I wanted to bring the policy up to just to bring it to attention, but also how do we police this? How do we know what's going on? I guess that's the question I have. It's a question parents have. If policies are being broken, how do we remedy that? So I don't know who to direct that at, but
Yeah, so I guess to the enforcement, I mean, we make sure our staff, and we've discussed this policy administratively at 3 meetings this summer, we make sure our staff are aware of what the policy means and what the parameters are within that policy. I've observed teachers handle these topics brilliantly in class, where, for instance, I was in an AP class towards the end of the year. The kids were prepping for the AP test. One of the questions, was to essentially it was pick a controversial topic, pick a topic that's popular in America right now, and create an argument, one way or another on it. And that was decided by the AP board on that. That wasn't our teachers doing it. But the teachers then had to filter field the questions from the students. Can I write on abortion? Can I write on pro-choice? Can I write on the 2020 election? Can I write on the 2016? And the teacher had to handle that in a manner that allowed the students to share ideas, not share their own belief on it, but allowed the kid to think about how they would write about that in a manner that developed a very coherent essay for the AP board to review. I think we've all been made aware of some situations where there were controversial topics that were brought up and the teacher didn't handle it in that manner. So from an enforcement standpoint, we need to make sure that our staff understand that and understand that, your opinion in this is to continue the discussion, but not to indoctrinate someone into your belief. And it's not to get into the idea of your position. An opinion is, take January 6th, for instance, when, the incident in Washington, D.C. with the Capitol. A teacher could make the statement to get discussion going that was a monumental moment in American history, right? People could argue that wasn't a monumental moment, but that opinion spurs conversation and allows kids to share various viewpoints. What we don't want the teacher to say was that date was a result of Trump's lack of leadership, just using that as an example, that starts to get down into what a person's, for instance, political position could be, that person's belief system could be. We want to be able to facilitate open discussion to help our kids think critically, which is where you start to get into the sharing of a little bit of opinion. We want to avoid putting kids in a position where they're questioning their beliefs. We want them to question topics. We want them to think critically about topics. We want them to think critically about text. We want them to think critically about world events. But, we also want to make sure that that's balanced with what are they learning from their parents? What do they believe? What are they hearing in their churches? What are they believing in their social circles? There's a balance test for that. But if we want kids to think critically, we do need to be able to engage these topics to a certain degree in class, while certainly avoiding indoctrination. When we do hear about it, we've intervened with staff. Principals have intervened with staff when it's not been handled appropriately. There was a handful of situations this past year where it wasn't. If we know about them, we can address them. It is an area that we're going to be working with our staff on, though, this school year, and I'll defer to Dr. Siebert on this as well.
No, I think Dr. Cook did a tremendous job, as he always does. I think the key word in all of this is balance, right? And making sure that we have balance in classrooms and we have balance when we're talking about controversial topics, because the reality is they are a part of classrooms. They're a part of education, right? Yeah, kids may come in with them in particular content areas. They're part of the curriculum for us to talk about. But as long as we do that with balance, and Dr. Cook, as he pointed out, we're going to work on that. We have some guidance that's going to be coming out that's going to help staff understand this concept of balance and what our classrooms should look like, what our hallways should look like. Kind of the thought is, and it was said in one of our administrative meetings, the concept of, a dorm room versus a classroom. Like, we don't need things in the classroom that lead to advocating for one way or the other. We need balance, and we need kids to have the opportunity to think critically about topics and teachers to be the facilitators of that discussion. And I think for the most part, we're highly successful with that already, and it's just going to be a good reminder. And as Dr. Cook said, there's always going to be some little bumps, and we have to continue to work on those.
Just when Dr. Cook, when you say, everything you had said, I agree with, but as you're describing those things, I think of, a middle schooler, high schooler, right? Young adults at that age where they can write and think and, look at different viewpoints. I think part of the concern is the grade level all the way down to kindergarten, where kids aren't of age to discern when they're told something. There's certain apps and things that I've seen and heard that are, I would say, not balanced. Okay, so I guess my biggest concern is at those age appropriate levels where they're hearing or seeing something that may be a balanced viewpoint to some, to others, maybe not so much. As kids obviously get older, of course, I'm all for controversy, learning from controversy, okay? But that's kind of where my concern is the most, at those early levels where they aren't able to discern those things. And then to Dr. Siebert's point, is there enough balance? And if we're going to trend towards more balance, that's great. But, are we currently at a point where we need to introduce more balance, I guess? So I don't know if...
Yeah, so, our message with staff is, we have an age-appropriate developed curriculum that's been approved by the board, 4K through 12 in various areas. And so, sticking with the curriculum and sticking with the pacing guides and sticking with the materials that are in the classroom is important. That does help address this. Now, I know last week that there was the discussion around some, library materials, things that people could search. I'm not going into that particular piece right now, but to go to the elementary class sets and to be in an elementary classroom, the controversial topics piece, the things that, when we say controversy, we think of them in the terms, I guess, of what perhaps would be the political light, the greater social things. I have not experienced a lot of that in elementary classes, and I do see teachers sticking to the curriculum and the pacing guides. I can't say it hasn't happened, but I've seen that more. Where I have seen more controversial topics addressed is at the secondary level, and a lot of times it's kid-generated. The kids come in with the questions. 2 years ago, the Parkland shooting down in Florida, that led to a lot of discussions in our schools. Those were discussions about gun rights. That was discussions about school safety. That was, and teachers were fielding that. The country, delivered us a curriculum in the moment that we had to follow. Similarly, in December of 19, when we had our situation at South, that delivered us a school safety discussions that we needed to have, and a lot of those topics were, could be perceived as controversial. And they came at the elementary level around safety discussions. Am I safe at school? Do I feel safe at school? At the secondary level, it morphed into gun rights discussions and where are we at as a country? And teachers had to handle that, and they had to handle that in the moment. Could it happen at the elementary level? It's certainly possible that it could come up. It's not as prevalent at the elementary level, though, as it is at the secondary level, and a lot of it is because it's kid-generated at the secondary. That's books aside. I'm not talking about books that were discussed last week.
I guess, in support of what your question is, we maybe rely on you two to monitor this with Jody. And I guess if there's a way down the road that we can hear something more about it, hopefully positive, we'd be open to do that. Okay? Okay.
Maybe a clarification. Thank you for the explanations, and I'm really happy to hear about the discussions and movement toward balance, and especially in the environment. I think the environment that the students are in is really important and kind of sets that foundation for the expectations and what they're experiencing. A couple things that came to mind just during the discussion. I think Mr. Zenobia was kind of referring to some apps and things. There's been discussion around the app Brain Pop and some of the content in that, which may not be a controversial issue that's deliberately brought to the classroom, but it may be access to controversial materials in the absence of teacher-guided instruction. And I think it's important, I know we have different pathways that those things can be escalated, but I think that kind of falls into this as well. And I'm probably even more concerned about things where young children have access to materials that may be biased, but we don't know, or may not be fully digested in the classroom. Another example to me would be the example of a teacher not standing for the pledge. Do we view that as controversial? Do we view that as appropriate or inappropriate? And I don't know if that's worth a discussion here or not, but when it comes to, controversial issues, I would say behaviors as much as academic content and topics of discussion would also fall into this.
I think you're right. Okay. All right. That was the discussion item we had for this evening. Next section would just be recommendations for something for future meetings, and I'm going to ask Joe first. What's in the vat waiting to come at us?
You have an update. We're working on scheduling a meeting with our Neola consultant to begin to process those. So we've got stuff coming. It's just a matter of getting stuff scheduled and when it's ready to launch. So that'll be in the next couple of months.
Okay. Any other future meeting thoughts? We can always come up with more. So with that, I would adjourn this evening's meeting. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay.